Thanks, Alex. Okay, thanks, Alex, and welcome everyone. Just want to say again, thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. I'm Charlotte. I work in the inclusion and diversity team at the RFU, and I've had the pleasure of working with Cara over the past year, developing our resources around neurodiversity and engaging people with neurodivergence. I'm sure this is going to be a really interactive and engaging hour. And as Alex mentioned, there will be a chance to ask a couple of questions at the end via the chat function. We might not have time to get to everyone's questions, but please do pop them in the chat anyway, and we can always do a bit of a wrap up afterwards and send that out. So yeah, if you've got a question and we don't get to it, sorry, but please put it in there anyway. I won't take up any more of your time. And I'll hand you straight over to Cara, who is a former Olympic rower and the co-founder and CEO of Neurodiverse Sport. So, Cara, over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Charlotte, and Alex as well. I've actually got my timer because I'm notoriously bad with timing, so I've got my timer set, and you guys only took 4 minutes, which is amazing. I'm going to really try not to labour over points today, and although we're going to try and make it really interactive, I'm going to try and move things on quickly so we can get to the key elements, and hopefully you can go away feeling a lot more confident. So, as Charlotte said, the title of this webinar is Engaging People with Neurodivergence in Rugby. It's an hour. I'm presenting. I'm Cara McMurtry, a former Olympic rower, also late diagnosed autistic. Before I was diagnosed as autistic, I was diagnosed literally from the age of 12 as having generalized anxiety disorder, depression, bipolar disorder. I was heavily medicated for that. And yeah, none of these kind of diagnoses helped me to understand myself any better, to feel any better, to self-support anymore. They actually made me feel worse. The medications made me feel worse. It wasn't until I got a diagnosis of autism and understood what that meant to me, how it manifested in me, how I could self-regulate, and what I needed to ask for, that my life really changed. And yeah, I went from really struggling to stay on the national team to being selected for the Tokyo Olympics. And that kind of the real positive versus negative of my experience in sport is part of what really drives me and my work with neurodiverse sport. But I'm also now surrounded by a really great group of people. It's not just me and my story. It's lots of people's stories, lots of people's effort. So with that, a little bit about what we're going to cover in this session. I've rolled objectives and the agenda into one. Again, we're strapped for time here. So we've done the introduction and the housekeeping. We're really going to try and cover neurodiversity and its relevance to rugby. Although, like I said, I don't want to kind of labour over the concept and context. There's a lot of reading that you can do after this to, I guess, to dive into that a little bit more. As Charlotte said, the resources that we co-created, they're out there, and I will signpost to them afterwards. They're really comprehensive, but I will cover it so we all have a basic understanding, a shared language. Part two, we're going to talk about managing individual needs in group settings. Part three, identifying appropriate challenge. Because, you know, neuro-inclusive practice is not just about not challenging people, it's about challenging them appropriately. And then we're going to look at distinguishing between kind of neurodivergent expression and then unacceptable behaviour, because, again, it's really important to distinguish that. And these are three key themes that have come up in our surveys and our conversations with different people in the rugby setting. So moving on to part one, neurodiversity and its relevance to rugby. So when we're talking about neurodiversity, we're talking about the natural variation of human perception, of human behaviour. So if you were to profile everyone, we would say that everybody fits into this category of neurodiversity. And And then those who are neurodivergent, they deviate from the so-called norm. So if you were kind of to plot every profile on a bell-shaped curve of standard deviation, like you could do for hair color, for eye color, for weight, etc., you would have more common characteristics in the middle as such. So those are more commonly shared, and then you would have less common characteristics on the outside. And you can kind of do the same thing for cognitive profiles. So it's not that neurodivergent individuals are less than in any way, it's that they are different. They will have particular strengths and challenges, or we will have particular strengths and challenges, and that's where the kind of nuance arises. So in terms of whether we're considering neurodivergence a difference, a difficulty, or a disability, it's very dependent on the individual themselves. So in terms of prevalence, we think that approximately 15 to 20% of the population are neurodivergent, and that kind of fits in with standard deviation. And you know, if you had more people that were neurodivergent, it wouldn't be considered neurodivergent anymore. But within that, some kind of key diagnoses would be dyspraxia, which accounts for approximately 5 to 6% of the population, autism 1 to 2%, dyslexia 10%, so there's a lot of dyslexic people out there, and ADHD 2 to 5%. But that really varies, and all of these kind of percentages are changing all the time with developments in diagnostic practices. So a person is diagnosed as neurodivergent when their condition, when their difference, not as neurodivergent, no one's diagnosed as neurodivergent, with a particular condition, when their differences significantly impact their ability to navigate life. So you might be diagnosed as autistic when you present with certain challenges, although other people might show traits of autism, but if they kind of don't present with those challenges, they probably won't get a diagnosis. So the diagnosis is kind of all about identifying challenge in order to enable people to get the support that they need. In terms of what sits within these kind of these common diagnoses. So autism, you kind of have to show that you have difficulties with social communication, that you express kind of restricted, repetitive interest and routine, and that you have significant differences in your sensory experience of the world. With ADHD, there's different combinations, but you've got persistent inattentiveness, hyperactivity, and impulsivity as the kind of key characteristics. With dyslexia, you've got difficulties in learning that, importantly, are kind of not better explained by physical or intellectual disability. So it's not that you can't hear properly or you can't see the words on the page. It's a difference in learning. And then dyspraxia is all about motor skill delays and motor difficulties that interfere with daily life. And all of these characteristics have to be present since early childhood. But what's really important to kind of note here is that not everyone will have access to a diagnosis. So there are certain intersectional elements that often prevent people from being diagnosed. So we know that historically women and girls were less likely to be diagnosed. For example, where it comes to autism, they think that, it's much more sort of a one-to-one diagnosis, male to female now, whereas in the past, they used to think it was for every 4 males diagnosed, there was 1 female. And even the questions they use in the test for autism still are kind of revolve around typically male interests. So they still ask about, if you're interested in planes, trains, and cars and things. So we see that there's still like an element of medical bias there. If you are from a minority ethnic background, and if you're from a kind of lower socioeconomic background as well, you're less likely to be diagnosed. I think it's in private schools at the moment, 20% of students have a diagnosis of dyslexia. Obviously, that's twice the diagnosis in the population, but it kind of just highlights the access to the diagnoses. Another reason why we just can't rely on diagnoses for giving people the support and the access to the support is that in terms of thresholds, diagnostic thresholds don't kind of account for overall difficulty. So I might have, I'm going to pick on dyslexia again, I might have significant kind of characteristics or traits of dyslexia, but in terms of other traits, I might not present with those other traits very strongly. But I get a diagnosis because I'm clearly past that threshold. And if I get a diagnosis, then I have this piece of paper that says I can, for example, get more time in exams, get a scribe, get help in some way or another, who just sits like just below the diagnostic threshold in, a number of traits. So traits of autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, they might sit just below the diagnostic threshold, and therefore they don't get a diagnosis, but their overall difficulties are really significant. So that's another reason why we shouldn't kind of rely on diagnoses. And then the third is co-occurrence. And we know that whereas autism and ADHD, we used to think that they were, I hope I'm not going to get this wrong, but mutually exclusive, so they couldn't exist together. And that was only 10, 15 years ago. We now know that they're much more likely to exist together. So if you're autistic, there's a 70% chance you'll have significant traits of ADHD. If you have ADHD, there's a 50% chance that you'll have significant traits of autism. So there's an awful lot of overlap. And if I have a diagnosis of, let's say, dyspraxia, someone who is supporting me shouldn't just say, right, I'm only going to give you supports for dyspraxia because that's the diagnosis that you have. Actually, we should be looking at the person in front of us, all of their challenges, because, there's a lot of flaws in the diagnostic system, unfortunately. And fun fact, I'm not looking at the messages that are coming in because there's just too many, and someone might have said this already, but depending on where you are in the country, it can take 5 to 7 years to gain a diagnosis. And there was one place in the Northeast where they calculated from the number of ADHD diagnoses that they were kind of working through, they calculated the number of years that it would take, like that you would have to be on the waiting list to get a diagnosis, and it was like 2,000 years. Because they were kind of taking such a long time to get through the referrals, essentially. So finally, before we kind of get into the rugby related, like crunchy stuff of the webinar, I just wanted to highlight the fact that we know that attitudes and environments that include people, in this case neurodivergent people, they lead to better experiences, they lead to better outcomes. Attitudes and environments that exclude, they lead to worse experiences and worse outcomes. So worse experiences might be miscommunication, frustration, isolation, people might drop out. The worse outcomes beyond a rugby context, so that's like disrupted education, you're far more likely to drop out of education or not achieve what you can. Unemployment, the statistics are changing for the better, but we know that only 20% of autistic people were in employment a few years ago. Now it's 30%, which is a great trend, but it's still obviously not where we want to be. And then criminalization, there's a really scary statistic around how many people in prisons have either autism, ADHD, or speech, language, and communication difficulties, and the estimate is up to 90%. So we can kind of see that, and it's a kind of rooted in this understanding is rooted in the medical versus social model of disability or difference, which historically the medical model would have said that, a person is different, they're broken, they're in need of fixing, it's all on them to change. The social model says, well, actually, they are different, but potentially it's environments, it's attitudes they're excluding. And if we change those environments and we change those attitudes, as well as that individual self-supporting, we're going to get better outcomes. So it's that shift from medical to social model that is helping to kind of turn the tide. So, into the kind of core part of the webinar. Please, am I gonna get to them? Yes, no, this is the correct slide. Hands up or type in the chat if you've ever spotted a player struggling in a session but thought, I don't have time to deal with this right now. I've got 18 other players to manage, and I'm sure for some of you, you can take 18 off there and insert 30, 40, 50. So lots and loads and loads and loads and loads of thumbs up. So a good amount of honesty here. Lots of people thinking that. And that is totally normal. It's a completely human response. I'm losing my words. I'm losing my words because I was super nervous about how many people were on this webinar. So something at Neurodiverse Sport, which we really, really try and keep at the forefront of our minds, is that when we're kind of, I say, preaching inclusivity, we are very conscious that we're also talking to human beings and that everybody has limited capacity. So as much as we're saying, well, this neurodivergent person, they're struggling behind the scenes in this way, well, we understand that coaches firstly might be neurodivergent. They have their own cognitive profile. They have their own other things going on in life. So it's absolutely understandable that you might get into a situation where you think, I just don't have time to deal with this, where your kind of executive functioning is just gone that day and you just don't know what to do. That being said, again, put your thumbs up if you got into this situation and then from there it spiraled into something that actually took longer to deal with in the long term. So you're like, I don't have time to deal with this. And then actually a kind of disruption, a conflict arose. There was a kind of loss of focus across the group. So again, lots of people, thumbs up. So I guess what that kind of shows us is that we need conversations like this, where we're starting to think in advance, and we're thinking about how we can preemptively change how we're approaching things, what we're doing, so that we stop incidents occurring rather than trying to react in the moment, because often that never works. So what feels like a drain in the moment, if we address it correctly, it's going to save time in the long term. If we can spot dysregulation early, and I'll go more into what that means later in the webinar, and we make small proactive adjustments, we can make a real difference. So with that, Alex, do you want to input poll 1? Oh, look, how fun is that?
Yes, so poll 1 should be with you now. So you've got a squad of 20. One player always hangs back during instructions, fiddling with something, not making eye contact. What do? Do you call them out to pay attention, ignore it and carry on, make a small adjustment to how you give information? So you should see that poll now. If you can't see it for any reason, please put your answer into the chat. I know you've not been able to see much of the chat there, but some very, very positive comments coming in that people are learning lots already. So it's going well, the webinar. So final little chance to get your chance to answer that. And I'm just going to end that poll there, and I'll share the results with you. So the results, the mass majority, 92% there, are going to make a small adjustment to how you give information, and just small percentages on ignore it and carry on, and 6% on call them out to pay attention.
I'm actually happy with the honesty from the 6 and the 2%. That's great. But with the let me do my calculations, 92%. The 92% that said I'd make an adjustment, it would be really great if you could write in the chat what that adjustment might be. And then I'll read out a few, and then we can move on to some examples that I've kind of pulled together already. So Vicky's written, check back with the players for their understanding, as I've often found that they may appear not to be listening, but sometimes are. And to be honest, that's really helpful, even if they're not listening or they are listening. It is good to clarify understanding, because people kind of think, they perceive the world, they think differently. I know that I had a communication plan. So it's actually called a management plan, but I like to refer to it as a communication plan because I don't feel like I needed managing. And on my communication plan, there were 3 things. One was, don't ask me open-ended questions about my feelings, because I have something called alexithymia, which is a difficulty identifying and expressing your emotions appropriately. And the second one was to check I got the intended message from a briefing, because I just tend to think in a different way. And clarification is something really, really simple that really helped. For me, it was when I was walking to the boat bay. For a rugby player, it could be just as you're walking to the pitch to do a drill. The third one was about having bland food available, because when I'm training really, really hard, I don't have the capacity to deal with that extra sensory input of like really flavoursome food that other people probably find delicious and I don't. If I could live off of rice and cheese my whole life, I would. It's not a great athlete's diet. So what else have people said? They've said, send us, one person hearted that for the rice and the cheese. So send a spare coach to redirect the player. I'm just picking out random ones, and what we can do is we can save the chat and send it out, kind of like synthesize it and send it out to everyone so they get these really good suggestions. So it depends on the circumstances and how severe the behaviour is. Hopefully we'll go through that in kind of part 3. Small group instructions if needed, direct shorter commands, follow up with players one-to-one, don't tell but ask. So these are all really great responses, and as I'm talking, if you feel like you can multitask, you could also kind of run through them as well, but like I said, we can send them afterwards. So I just pulled together some really simple low effort adjustments you can use tomorrow, and I'm sure people have included some of these in the chat. But for the sake of those individuals on the call where, you know, this is a totally new topic, let's kind of work through them together. So we could think about changing proximity or positioning, moving closer when we speak instead of calling across the pitch. With that, we could even pair someone up if they're comfortable expressing to a teammate their difficulties with auditory processing. A teammate could repeat something to them or use gestures to help them out. We can use visual cues, gestures to demonstrate or point to where players should be, and I'm sure a lot of rugby coaches do this already, rather than relying on long verbal instructions. So chunking information is really, really helpful. So what that means is just giving one clear instruction at a time, rather than stacking them. So rather than saying, do this, then this, then this, then this, say, do this, they do it, and then you give them the second instruction, they do it. And if you don't have, that's where kind of like something that's written down and maybe visual can really help as well. So then they can see and they can choose to follow one instruction at a time. We can check for understanding subtly. So, you know, you can develop you can develop this language with the individual, but it might just be a quick thumbs up, or if they can feel comfortable saying, show me, rather than you kind of saying, did you listen? Offer predictability, so starting every drill with the same simple sequence. So it might be watch, walk through, go, so players know what's coming. And I know a lot of neurodivergent players, they really, really appreciate being able to watch before they do something. And they appreciate walkthroughs and being able to kind of be behind a teammate. And again, you could pair people up if you know that someone feels comfortable with an individual, and there's that trust between them. Give people processing time. So for you yourself, you could kind of count 2 silent beats before expecting an action, because some players will need that pause. I know that there are other coaches there's a football coach who speaks really well about his players with autism and ADHD. And he talks about the fact that those players have so much going on in their mind. So a key kind of component of autism and ADHD is, for some individuals, we obviously know it manifests differently in everyone, is that difficulty with sensory discrimination. So being able to say, without thinking about it, this piece of information doesn't matter, this piece of information doesn't matter, and getting rid of that white noise. So for a lot of individuals with ADHD and autism, everything is coming in and they're processing everything. So their minds are working at 100 miles an hour all the time. So he says, see it like a car. If you had a car driving at 100 miles an hour, you know that it's going to need a lot more braking space than a car driving at 40 miles an hour. And I'm not saying other players are driving at 40 miles an hour and that means they're slower than the person with ADHD or autism. I'm talking about how much they're processing. The wheels are spinning really fast, the smoke's going. We need to give people more time than others because of that reason. So how can we build in that braking space into sessions? I've kind of mentioned it a few times, but assigning a peer anchor, pairing a player with someone that is calm and consistent, who can kind of model quietly without spotlighting them. I know for me, like who I was paired with as an athlete made such a difference to how comfortable I felt and how confident I felt. And then, just being aware of our language. So instead of saying, like pay attention, you can say, think about watching this closely, it will make it easier. So explaining the why. And I think I'd like to kind of give a little context to that. So there are some really stark statistics again around individuals or children with ADHD. By the time they're 10 years old, research suggests that they will have received 20,000 more negative or corrective comments than their so-called neurotypical peers. So the peers that don't have ADHD. So again, this really kind of highlights the context is really important. And I think sometimes I'm really aware personally of when I'm doing kind of DEI inclusion work, of avoiding the buzzwords and of, I'm not just saying let's make it nice and soft and fluffy for everyone. I'm saying these are kind of real people with real stories and real difficulties. And there are kind of real things that we can do to help them, essentially. If a child has received that many more negative and corrective comments than their peers by that age, it makes sense that we don't want to add to that. We want to potentially use slightly more positive language to help shift the narrative, to help them feel like sport is their safe space where they can really express themselves. And same with autism. We know that 70% of autistic people will have experienced some sort of bullying in their life. So again, whereas in sport, we kind of think we need to make everyone hard, and the way that we do that, and resilient, and the way that we do that is we treat them a certain way, we challenge them all the time. For some people, that challenge needs to be presented in a different way, and you can still challenge people whilst being positive, and that's the reason behind it. So before I move on, can anyone think, does anyone want to put in the chat? I'm sure you've been writing anyway. Any more low effort adjustments that you can think of that we haven't kind of talked about? There has been actually so many that have come through, so probably exhausted by this point. I think the key summary of this kind of slide is that hopefully, like, none of these take too much time. They don't take extra minutes. They just kind of reframe how we use the minutes that we already have. And it's the difference between firefighting later and building support and safety in earlier. So to summarize this section, we're doing really well for timing. This is crazy for me, but I do feel like I'm speaking at 100 miles an hour, so I'm sorry. You're going to have to go away and like digest all this for like 2 hours afterwards. So to summarize this section, it's not necessarily all about individualized programs for everyone. It's about running sessions with built-in flexibilities, because you are a coach. Most people on here are probably volunteer coaches. You cannot create an individualized session for everyone. It's not possible, but you can build in flexibility. You can offer clear structures so players know what's coming next. You can allow for different ways of engaging. It's all about looking for the high impact, low effort adaptations. So, consistent check-in phrases, your good thumbs up signals, visible session outline on a whiteboard, plus verbally setting out the flow and clearly at the start. Using peer leadership strategically. So absolutely, some neurodivergent players will regulate better when they're paired with the peers that they trust. Not always, but sometimes. And then just as a coach, understanding that you don't have to fix everything in the moment. But part of managing group environments is knowing when to park something and to circle back later rather than firefighting mid-session. So with that statement, how do we know when to address and when to park? So when to challenge an individual and when to pull back. And that's what we're going to look at in the next section or the next part. So yes, Moira, we will absolutely send you the talking points, the slides, the chats, everything. Like I said, I appreciate I am going super fast, and for some people it's going to be a lot to take in. This is also recorded, so you'll be able to revisit it afterwards. So Alex, I think it's time for another poll.
Okay, I'll get this poll up now. So when a player pushes back in frustration, what is your instinct? Is it to push, apply a challenge, pull back, ease off the pressure, or a route change the approach task? Let us know your thoughts. If you can't see the poll for any reason, put your answer in the chat, please. So when a player pushes back in frustration, what's your instinct? Yeah, Lottie, yeah. Depends on the player. So they're all coming in now. What do you think? What's your instinct? What would you think is going to come to you straight off? When a player pushes back in frustration, what's your instinct? Is it to push, apply challenge, pull back, ease off pressure, or route change the approach stroke task? So most people are coming now. Last little chance to get your responsive. If you want to put any extra sort of thoughts in there, then put them in the chat function for us. But I'm going to end that poll there and share those results. So the majority have gone for the route change, followed by the pullback, and then lastly, you've got 13% that say they're going to push and apply a bit of challenge.
So It was a trick question. A couple of you in the chat actually did say it depends on the player. And I think with this question, there's no wrong instinct necessarily. What it does depend on is not just the player, but their state of regulation. So for neurodivergent athletes, dysregulation happens when demand outstrips capacity. So earlier we talked about the reasons why a person might be diagnosed as autistic, ADHD, dyslexic, dyspraxic. There are other neurodivergent conditions. What underpins them are difficulties with things like sensory regulation, executive function, which is like our brain's admin, it's the planner and the organizer, emotional regulation, social communication differences. When when the demand on a person outstrips their capacity in that realm, they can become dysregulated. And it can be really hard to spot because everyone shows that kind of dysregulation differently, but there are some really reliable cues to look out for. So I was going to say, before I throw some suggestions out there, can you think of any signs of dysregulation? But I'm not sure if that's too much of an open-ended question, considering some of you might not be familiar with the term. Oh look, I missed a slide as I was talking. So the signs of dysregulation, they don't just fit into these categories, but these are some talking points. So there might be physiological or sensory. So it might be that you see tension, someone's kind of frozen on the spot. They are visibly trying to block out sensory input or avoid sensory input. So they might put their hands over their ears, they might look down, walk away, turn their body away. You know, it might not be obvious. I know for me, I have a lot of sensory processing differences or difficulties. I never put my hands over my ears. I just kind of put up with it because I didn't want to seem different. But something I did do is I would often kind of skulk off to the changing rooms or skulk off to my car to give myself some decompression time. They might appear hyperactive or agitated. And, you know, for some people, this might be them in their regulated state, but you probably will get to know some of your players and you'll know when they're acting differently to when they feel good. They might be unusually silent, or they might kind of go completely insular and internal. They might start, you know, flinching at noise, at different kind of sensations where they didn't before because their capacity is really full. Like I said, there are times when I can deal with different flavors, but when I'm on training camp and I don't have a massive capacity because I've used it up, I've exhausted myself training, I become much more sensitive to those flavors. And for other people, it might be becoming much more sensitive to, you know, the sound of a whistle, the sound of someone shouting, to the contact of rugby. In terms of communication and behavioural signs, someone's responses might become short, they might become blunt or literal, they might kind of lose that social nuance, they might become argumentative or overly defensive to simple coaching cues. You know, they might say like, I am doing it, or you didn't say that properly. They might be irritable, snappy, overly intense. They might have like an overly intense focus on fairness or injustice, which is probably something that they feel anyway, but when they are regulated, they might be able to kind of withhold. When they're dysregulated, it might become more of an obvious obsession. You might see more black and white thinking, so like, this is pointless, I'm rubbish, what's the point then? You might see disengagement or refusal disguised as a logical disagreement. So, you know, this drill doesn't make any sense, or I don't need to do this. And you might see them trying to regain control by negotiating or changing the session terms or insisting on a specific routine. And then emotional or social signs might be a sudden withdrawal from a chat. So they stop joking, they start standing alone, or the opposite, they might overcompensate, become very loud, disruptive, comedic. They might have an increased sensitivity to tone, perceiving neutral instructions as criticism or hostility. So that's the hypervigilance. They might misread teammates' body language or intent. So maybe seeing banter as a personal attack. And then expressing confusion or frustration verbally. So saying, I don't get it. It's too much at once. Just tell me properly. So not always, but these can be the signs to look out for of dysregulation starting to occur because the demand on a person has outstripped their capacity. So my rule of thumb is if somebody is, and I'll put this on the screen in a minute, but if somebody's regulated and resistant, then we can absolutely push them in a session. If somebody is dysregulated and resistant, then we should pull back. If somebody's disengaged completely, we need to try a different route. So imagine a player says, this drill is pointless. Do you think that this is coming from a place of defiance or dysregulation? So lots of people say, but it could be either, to be fair. This could be someone who is just playing up. But that's where you kind of have to develop these relationships with people. Use a diagnosis if they have disclosed, but if they haven't, try to understand what their baseline is, and if they're kind of erring from it. So you could push them a little and you could read the response and you can pull back if needed. It doesn't kind of have to be all or nothing. We know that behaviour can sit on top of many internal states, and your job as a coach is unfortunately to read the unseen and respond. Something really important to, I guess, you can't coach skill into someone who's dysregulated. So you kind of have to coach the regulation first, or allow for the regulation first, and we'll talk about how you can do that, and then the performance second. So there's no point in trying to drill someone if they're in a really dysregulated state. So with that in mind, Alex, we're on to poll 3, I think.
Okay, I'll get that up now, so you should see that in front of you. Our player throws the ball down and says, I already know this. Why are we doing it again? What do you say? Do you push, then prove it, pull back, take a breath and rejoin when you're ready, or change the route? All right, show me your version of it and we'll build from there. So I can see the answers coming in now. So again, remind you that a player throws the ball down and says, I already know this. Why are we doing it again? What do you say? Are you going to push, pull back, or change the route? Last little chance to give your response in there. Any other comments, and please do put them in the chat. Been great interaction and great sharing tonight. So last little chance before I end this poll. Last few seconds. What do you think? Okay.
So it's really great, the answers that are coming in the chat as well. Alex, I'll let you run through the poll.
Yes, so the poll is finished there, and 54% are going to change the route, followed by a pullback, 34%, and 11% are going to push. So a mix again, but the majority are going for change the route.
And lots of people in the chat are saying it depends what's happened before, it depends on the context, depends on the player, and that's exactly it. So hopefully, what these polls are doing and what this conversation is doing, it's giving you options, and then you do have to kind of use the nuance of the situation to understand and to test out the best way to respond. But I talked about coaching regulation, and you need to coach regulation before you coach performance. And it's like, well, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a social worker, I'm not a therapist. How on earth do I teach regulation? Well, it can be as simple as literally responding in an appropriate way at an appropriate time. So, if they are, as I mentioned earlier, regulated and resistant, it might be that you say, well, then prove it. And if you judge them dysregulated and resistant, that's where you might say, take a breath, rejoin when you're ready. And if they are disengaged completely, that might be where you say, all right, show me your version of it and we're building. So kind of to summarize this section, as I've kind of mentioned, challenge is still essential, even though we're talking about inclusion and understanding people and working with people. Where it comes to neurodivergence, neurodivergent players are often either under-challenged or over-challenged, kind of due to assumptions about ability or emotional resilience. But actually the key marker is not necessarily behaviour, it's regulation level. And it's about building that understanding of the context and of that person to try and gauge what level of regulation they are in at that time, and how best to respond. So we've got about 12 minutes left. So we're going to move on to the final part, which is a big topic. And we're just going to touch on it, but it's about behaviour and defining the difference between neurodivergent expression and unacceptable behaviour. And it's a really grey line. We've been talking about regulation and dysregulation, and the fact is that someone might be in a dysregulated state, not necessarily through their own fault, but it can still impact negatively on others. So we're just going to touch on how we navigate that really kind of difficult scenario, where there's not necessarily one person at fault, but in terms of coaching groups of people, there does need to be a level of responsibility and accountability. So, oh no, I skipped. I think, Alex, we've got we were going to do a poll, but we're not going to do a poll. I think you're going to paste some statements in the chat and get people to respond to them.
Yes, I'm just going to put in some.
I'm really putting you to work.
That's good. Like it. So what would be your response? Would you go for red or would you go for amber? So red needs consequence, or amber is regulation, regulate first. So they're swearing at themselves. What are you going for? Some got ambers coming in here for most people. Can see, yeah, amber seems to be coming out. Fantastic. So I appreciate I'm not going to get everyone's in, but I'm going to move on to the next one. So is it red or amber, throwing equipment into space where others are nearby? Is it red or is it amber? What are you going to go for? So I can see people are coming out as red on that one. Keep them coming in. Got a few more of these to go, but red seems to be the way to go on that one. Oh, an amber in there from Joe. Amber followed by red. Oh, it's Kirsty. So we're going to move on to the next one. Walking away during instruction and pacing. What are you going to go for, amber or red? So seems to be in favour of amber at the moment. We can see those coming in. So clearly amber on that one. Next one's coming up. Making a joke that undercuts a teammate during feedback. What are you going for? And most of it seems to be red. A few ambers in there actually, but most of that seems to be red. Last couple. Oh, amber. So a few, a bit more of a mixture there, but it's of red. Jumper over ears, muttering so loud and backing away. What are you going to do there? Is it a red or amber approach? Amber, but that's good. And the final one, just to keep interacting with these, this is last one, but thanks very much for your quick responses. Is it red or amber? Repeatedly interrupting with unrelated comments. Are you red or amber on that one? Red is coming out and stuff. Oh, some amber there. Amber. Oh, some more mixture again. So quite a lot of red, amber. Okay. So that's all of them done there. I'll hand back to you.
Perfect. Thank you. So what's great is that what's coming through the chat is exactly what I hoped was going to come through the chat, and that's that, you know, some are clearly amber, some clearly signals of dysregulation, and maybe even complete overload, and they potentially require that, you know, regulation first approach. And then some are red, very clearly need consequences straight away, and then some are somewhere in between, and it depends on the context. So this is where neuro-inclusive coaching isn't about removing consequences entirely. It's about applying the right intervention at the right time. And what we're kind of seeing here is potential states of dysregulation that when they go unaddressed, they can reach a kind of point of no return. And that's really, really going to determine how and when we address the behavior. So even if it is a behavior that needs consequences, once a person has reached a point where they are shutting down, they're in meltdown, maybe long-term burnout, there's kind of no getting through to them in that moment. And so at that point, it's not that the behavior is, you know, completely excusable, but it's sort of unavoidable. They've reached boiling and the bubbles are going over, the foam is going over, the water's going over. The only thing that you can do is turn the heat down, and then we can kind of address that behavior later down the line. But it's not just about addressing the behavior, it's addressing the why. So let's talk a bit more about shutdown. So it might look like someone quietly disappearing to the edge of the pitch, you know, slowing movement, blank face, avoids eye contact, stops engaging. So personally, I never melt down, I shut down. I actually lose my ability to speak. So I'll start slurring my words, and I'll lose my words as well. I can't grasp them. I might even go to, if I'm really, really just completely burnt out, I might not even be able to speak. And it's quite distressing. So that often happens if I've been stood under like a fluorescent light, does something to my brain. And yeah, I just can't, it's almost like it feels like it fragments my brain. So in terms of meltdown, a person might, you know, outburst vocally, their frustration at themselves or others. They might throw equipment, they might be aggressive, have aggressive body language. And burnout is really the long-term consequences of, you know, prolonged dysregulation, shutdown, meltdown. So that's when prolonged effort or stress outweighs someone's ability to recover. And it can be physical, emotional, and cognitive kind of shutdown in the long term. So as I mentioned, this behavior is kind of unavoidable in the moment. Doesn't mean necessarily that it's acceptable. You know, if someone has a meltdown and they throw something at someone, that might be an unavoidable behavior. They might almost not have control over it in the moment. It's not an appropriate behavior, but it's about what happened before that caused that. If we just punitively punish in that moment, we're not really going to change anything in the long term. So to summarize this section, and regarding disruptive behavior, the first question that we should really ask ourselves is this affecting the bottom line or my own sensibilities? So I kind of didn't mention this, but a really obvious example was kind of overused as eye contact. I swear it came up in the chat at some point. Someone said something about eye contact. But to a degree, I would say that is a behavior that is possibly affecting sensibilities over the bottom line. So if I know that person struggles with eye contact, there's too much sensory information to take in, actually they're focused much more if they're looking at. That's not affecting the bottom line. And do I have a problem? Was I just think that's the way everyone should act and it's a sign of respect? That's affecting my sensibilities. If the answer is yes, it is affecting the bottom line, so it's affecting performance, safety, etc., the team, then the question is what preceded it, not necessarily how do we punish it. We can look at consequences after we kind of pick away at what happened before. We let that person re-regulate, and then we kind of say, right, what happened to get into this state and how do we stop it happening again? Now, if you've offered a route back to regulation, you've given clarity, and that player continues to choose the same route, then accountability in that situation is appropriate and fair. But it's all about helping someone reroute so that they can avoid an experience that they almost definitely don't want. Being dysregulated is not a nice experience, but sometimes people can feel it's unavoidable, and it's about helping them to, like I said, to reroute, to go around that. And being consistent, it prevents resentment within the group. So players will accept differing needs being supported as long as boundaries and expectations are clearly communicated to the squad as a whole. So I guess the message is, we'll meet you where you're at, but you also have a responsibility to meet the standard once you're regulated and supported. And it's different when you're talking about very young children, but I guess that kind of awareness and responsibility is something that we want to help individuals to develop as they grow through the ages. So just kind of a little suggestion, imagine saying to your squad, again, depending on their age, you don't have to get this right straight away, but if we support you and you still choose not to engage or respect a group, that's when accountability kicks in. So it's about clarifying the standards, and it's about just drip feeding the awareness of self-responsibility, our actions have consequences, and what we can do to, I guess, best guide our own behaviour and the behaviour of others. So it's really about, it's not excusing behaviour, it's about stopping the environment from causing it unnecessarily or negative behaviour. So next slides are just a thank you and a bit of signposting. I'm also just going to paste in the chat a sort of self-reflection prompt as well, as I go through the next slides. So that self-reflection says paste in chat. That's the instruction to myself. That self-reflection prompt is, think of a moment where a player's behaviour wound you up. Now ask, was it actually defiance or was it dysregulation that looked like defiance? What would you have changed if the question you asked yourself in that moment was, what state are they in, instead of why aren't they listening? So, in summary, on this slide, you can see there's a link to and like I said, I'll send this out afterwards, the resources that we co-created with the RFU EDI team, so you can access them via the coaching hub or via our resources library. And please do also sign up via the QR code or via the link at the bottom there, if you would like to receive post-workshop resources and reflection prompts. And with that, I think I'm bang on time with absolutely no time to wrap up, but I managed to do it. Lots of fumbling and stumbling, but hopefully got across everything that needed to. Hopefully you found it really helpful. And yeah, thank you for being incredibly engaging. And Alex, I think I'll pass it back to you so I can just have a moment to stop talking.
That's fine, yeah. I'm just going to bring Charlotte in. Is there any questions, Charlotte?
Yes, I've made a note of a couple from the chat. So the first one is, how can we manage parents who may not be aware of other players' neurodivergence, who are unhappy with behaviours not being challenged amongst the squad, but their child, who is neurotypical, are? So basically, parents of neurotypical children uh, not being particularly accommodating of other children in the squad
Mm.
who've got neurodivergence.
Yeah, like there's not a right or wrong answer because it will obviously depend on the situation, but like I think I would try to have a conversation with them in an appropriate time and space where I say, you don't want to have to like literally give them this webinar on like what neurodivergence is, but I think without specifically talking about an individual without their consent, I would say, there are some children who, experience the world differently, they behave differently, they face hidden challenges that you might not be aware of. And this is what we are doing behind the scenes to strike a balance between supporting them and ensuring behavioural standards are upheld. So I think maybe just starting that conversation and seeing what comes of it, because I think it is just that people haven't thought and they're unaware, and you might start that conversation and you might be surprised at the positivity of the response. If not, then if you don't get a positive response, then I would probably say, Charlotte, that's where you step in and tell me if there are any like policies or things that the RFU have.
Yeah, definitely. If there is ever kind of discrimination experienced in the game, then absolutely can be reported to the RFU through the Speak Up channel. So that covers all different forms of discrimination, and neurodivergence is, part of that as well. So if someone is ever treated unfairly or mistreated because of it, then yes, please do let us know. Next question we have is how, oh, I'll do this one first. What do we do when someone with ADHD talks over a captain's speech at the start?
Um, I'm not. So I think it depends if it's happening repeatedly. If it's happening repeatedly, then I would have a conversation with that individual at another time, because on the balance of things, although they might struggle to, withhold their impulse to talk, they're in a team sport and they've kind of signed up to a certain code of conduct. They might need to put a bit more effort into withholding from talking over the captain because it's really important because other people need to hear the instructions. I might say that you can't do this. Are you struggling to not do it? It might be that they don't understand the rules. If they're struggling to not do it, then we can say like, is it that we can distract you? Do you need do you need to flick a hairband on your wrist? Do you need to do some active stretching while I'm talking? So I think it's about starting that conversation with the individual. In the moment, it would probably be about sort of politely just saying like, we don't talk over each other while we're in a briefing. And you don't have to single an individual out, but you don't also have to tiptoe around an issue if it is kind of negatively impacting everyone.
Thanks, Cara. How can we encourage parents to declare neurodiverse players to start and or aid coaches to make accommodations when needed?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? Someone just wrote a really good suggestion to the last one in the chat, which was I would hold a rugby ball and say those with it. If you have the talking stick, if you have the rugby ball, you can talk. And then I got distracted and I didn't listen to what you said.
That's absolutely fine. How can we encourage parents to declare neurodiverse players and or aid coaches to make accommodations when needed?
I think in terms of parents, they need to feel confident that their child is not going to be negatively discriminated against if they declare. So I think it's about creating a culture of, I guess, I say inclusivity, I can't think of a better word. I'm losing my words now, I've spoken too much. But creating a culture in which people feel, and yeah, like there's not going to be any judgment. It's just a neutral thing. It's just this is my child. Like, how do we work best with them? I think there's a lot of fear when it comes to parents and disclosure. In terms of coaches, I think getting them to understand that you will have neurodivergent players in your squad no matter what. You can either work with them and get the best out of them and get the best out of everyone else, or you can ignore it. It's not going to go away. Like, it is just a case of, do you want to support this version of themselves or not? Like, we're living in a society, and society is moving more towards a space in which people feel a lot more confident to self-advocate. The younger generation are much more confident to self-advocate, so they're not going to, hold it all in now and just blend in and force themselves to act in a way that is completely counterintuitive. They're going to be proudly different. Like, that's just the cohort that's coming in, and therefore, yeah, you're either going to have a lot of clashes or you're going to have to work with it.
Fab. And then last question, because 2 minutes. Um, how best should I plan my sports sessions to accommodate for various levels of neurodiversity, working from a basis of developing sessions for a neurotypical group, and then take into considerations aspects such as interest levels, difficulty of task, etc. But I'd like my sessions to then be able to support other coaches who might follow my session plan. Does that make sense?
So yeah, I've had this conversation with other sports like tennis, and there were some really great ideas around, if you wanted to go big or go home, you could, rather than saying, right, this is a session for kids with ADHD, this is a session for kids with autism, da da, you could say, okay, this is a small numbers session, this is a quiet session, this is a what you would call typical mainstream session. But you can just provide diversity, and then people can self-select where they feel most comfortable. So I would, you can use the resources that we've created, and I would work back from, okay, what are these key different kind of traits that people experience? And how can we set sessions up around those and just let people, yeah, like I said, go where they feel most comfortable. And I know that in tennis, they found that there were some people that stayed permanently in a group because they were maybe, I know in the USA they call it more profoundly autistic or disabled. Not sure that that's totally PC in the UK, but they had higher support needs. So they would stay kind of permanently in that group. There were other individuals, autistic ADHD, who, in the right environment felt more able. So they would join that group, and then they would progress to another group, and they would kind of be a bit more transient between groups. And it wasn't just disabled, not disabled, neurodivergent, not neurodivergent. It was, like I said, there was a key characteristic for each session. So small numbers, low sensory environment. One might be tag rugby, one might be we don't speak for this part, or just like we mix it up, and for this 5 minutes we don't talk, for this 5 minutes we only take 3 steps at once. And then another group might be, this is traditional rugby.
That's
That's a big
fab.
task.
Yeah.
That's a big task. But you did say you wanted to create session plans that other rugby coaches can use, so I felt like there's a
It's
bit of a
go
business
big,
mind
yeah.
in there.
Definitely. I think we'll call it there just because it's 11 minutes past 8 and conscious that we don't want to take up everyone's time. But if there are other comments in the chat, etc., then as mentioned, we'll do a bit of a wrap up. We'll share the recordings, we'll share the chat comments, key, because there's loads and loads of key ideas in the chat as well. And I don't know if you can see the comments, Cara, but just everyone's saying thank you and that this had a really lovely session. So thank you so much for it. And Alex, I'll hand back over to you. Or Cara, you come off mute if you.
Oh no, I was just going to say thank you, that was all.
Yeah, cool.
Thank you all. Brilliant webinar. Brilliant contributions from everyone. Thank you. Have a nice evening.